let's begin. Villains are the most interesting characters in the realm of fiction. You could also argue in reality, whether it is the shocking nature of their deeds or the banality of their evil, villains hold up a mirror to society and our structures in a way that I think often heroes do not. Evil is senseless and chaotic in its most pure form. It doesn't discriminate or weigh pros and cons or victimize based on any particular rubric. Great villains, though, are steeped in ideology. They have a belief system. They've thought about what they're going to do and why, and they have made moral calculations as to who's going to live and who's going to die, who will be free and who will be controlled. That's what we're going to be talking about today. My name is Stephen Kent. I'm the author of How the Force Can Fix the World, Lessons on Life, Liberty, and Happiness from a Galaxy Far, Far Away. And today I am joined by Aaron Ross Powell of LibertyCon and Micheal Cannon of the Cato Institute. And we're going to be diving into three of my favorite tyrants. There we go. Three of my favorite tyrants: Darth Vader of Star Wars, Thanos of Marvel and the Avengers, and Magneto of Marvel and X-Men. Three villains with distinct missions for their worlds, all connected by at least one thing. It's that they feel quite justified. This matters for every single person in this room and at this conference here today. It's not that we're just taking a break to talk about comics and movies. This is connected to the real issues. You're not fighting a boogeyman as activists for liberty. You're in a battle against authoritarians, small and large, in all different walks of life, who have in most cases thought about why they're going to do what they are going to do, and can articulate what come across sometimes as, like they've really rationalized this. You might recognize these children on screen. They are just kids, and they are all going to be monsters. And we need to try to grapple with that. If you look at their eyes, you can probably pick them out of your history books. And this is the kind of thing that keeps us all up at night at every Students for Liberty conference. So I'm going to go ahead and join the panel over here. But Micheal, Aaron, I want to go ahead and give you an opportunity to sound off on sort of the moral universe of despots. And what do you think drives people to embrace the politics of totalitarianism?
Well, you mentioned ideology, and I think ideology is a further down the road motivation for a lot of people who drift in authoritarian directions. I think the foundation of it more, as we look at young kids who might get motivated into this, or the young people in this country right now who are drifting in authoritarian directions, a lot of it I think is more one or more of three things, namely hate, fear, or love, that we see. We see a lot of it in, I hate these people, or I hate this thing, I want to put a stop to it, or whatever this thing is that's happening makes me fearful, uncomfortable, and so on, and I want to put a stop to it or control it in some way, or I want to help, and the reason that my help is not working, the reason that we have not achieved the goals is because people aren't basically going along with the plans that I have made for them or for others, and I love people enough that I am going to I'm going to override, I'm going to shut it down. And then all of those, I think, then lead to ideology. The ideology is retrofitted to fit the underlying kind of emotional drive.
That reminds me a lot of Thanos, actually, because particularly like Thanos in the Avengers, you have this one version of him in, I guess, Infinity War. And we're just going to be talking about movie canon today, just because like comic books and books gets you way too deep on some of these characters, so we're going to stick to films. But like Thanos, like he sort of reasoned out that 50% of the universe needs to be wiped out. And then by the time he realizes that the Avengers will reverse what he's done unless he just kills everybody, he's much darker in Endgame and willing to just wipe the slate entirely clean. But Micheal.
So thanks for having me on the panel. I do have to leave at 5 minutes early.
We'll let you go. Yeah.
I'm sorry if that comes in the middle of a question. I want to thank you all for coming here. And as I told my fellow panelists when we were putting this together, I hope some of you in the audience have a much deeper and richer knowledge about all of these characters than we do. And I hope that you contribute that knowledge to our conversation. I want to agree generally with what Aaron said about how people retrofit ideologies to fit, to justify their underlying passions and what their passions are telling them to do. I want to disagree a little. I don't think that hate is really. I think hate is what fear develops into, and it is. No one starts there. I think everyone starts from a place of. I think everyone is basically a good person, and wants to connect with other people and experience love and connection with other people. And the most fascinating villains, historical or fictional, are the ones who, as Aaron says, develop an ideology that ends up justifying all the atrocities that they commit. And the most compelling stories are the ones where you can see where things went wrong and where their devotion to themselves, and justifiable devotion to themselves and the people around them turned them, allowed them to justify some really horrible acts. If we draw from fiction, we talked about ranking these villains.
Yep. We're going to start with Magneto today.
In terms of their plausibility. And I'll just go ahead and rank all of them really quickly and tell you why. Magneto, I think, is the most fascinating of all of the three villains that you mentioned, because he has the most plausible story for why he became such a mutant supremacist and was willing to do horrible things, kill innocents, and even I think at one point he tried to induce mutations in Homo sapiens to turn them into mutants, and it's such a compelling story because he was a Jewish boy in Germany in the 1930s. His family was taken to Auschwitz. They were separated. They killed his. By the way, if you don't like spoilers, you might want to leave now. They killed his mother in front of him to elicit his mutant powers, and then he went into hiding for years. People who were fearful of mutants, people who are arguably good people who were just afraid of these so much more powerful people in their midst, killed his wife and child in front of him. He was shunned and he was hunted, and his relatives were killed for decades. And then there were these campaigns to register mutants, and he saw the same things happening over and over again that he saw in the 1930s. And it is very plausible that just out of self-defense, he would adopt this ideology that these Homo sapiens are bad, and that we mutants, if we are going to survive, have to do something about them. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got Thanos.
Let's stick on Magneto for now. You were about to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to pick up briefly on something you said. You mentioned so that his plot to turn everybody into mutants. And it raises this interesting thing that shows up in these movies. It shows up, I think, in the way that Star Wars approaches its villains. It definitely shows up in the way that Thanos is written, which is, remember, these are narratives. And so they're also trying to tell a story. And they're written by, the writers have their own views and all that. And there's a tension in all of these about these villains are bad, but also we like them and they're kind of cool. And so the tension in X-Men with Magneto, he wants to turn everyone into mutants. That's bad, right? Except that these are movies about how awesome it is to be a mutant. Like these are, and they're all these like super powered people. There are the weird looking ones on the fringes, but these are movies about like impossibly gorgeous people saving the world with superpowers, right? And so from that perspective, like making everybody that doesn't sound, there is a tension there. And I think that tension, we can talk about it when we get to the other ones, shows up in the other things as well, that there's an allure to having power. And even when the movies are critiquing power, you can get a sense behind the scenes that they're a little bit drawn to it.
I think the thing that's always interested me in some of these characters, and I guess in Magneto you have this divide with him and his best friend from childhood and youth, Charles Xavier. In the American context, and this is sometimes a little bit overblown in discussion of Magneto and Professor X, but we often tend to look at it through the Martin Luther King and Malcolm X drive, sort of this, basically the coexist narrative versus race essentialism. Like, we are black with a capital B. They are white with a capital W. We will never be able to just coexist as if race doesn't exist. That's sort of part of that big debate. That embodies itself in this divide as well. And I think a lot of kids and young people today, particularly ones who don't come to conferences like this, think of the Malcolm X's of the world, think of the Magnetos of the world. It's like the person who's willing to do the thing, willing to actually like put their body on the line, do dangerous things, put themselves out there. And Professor X is a squish. He just wants to talk and make friends and backslap with the President of the United States. But Magneto, he takes injustice seriously, and like that's really hard to contend with.
And I mean, and the injustices that he is contending with are real, too. I mean, that's what makes him, I think, as sympathetic as he is the Nazis were bad and they did bad things, and then the way that mutants are treated, the way we're showing them being treated, is bad and maps onto modern world racism. And so he clearly is the most sympathetic. I think it's just the problem with supervillains is that the sympathetic motivations have to turn into plot points, which then just turn into kind of the wahaha take over the world sort of stuff, which is often somewhat disconnected. But yeah, I mean, I think that tension and there is a desire to do something, this is one of the reasons I think libertarians often have a hard time rhetorically is the emergent processes of the market sound a lot like not doing anything. Yeah. And so when it's like, here's this problem that I'm hurting right now, how do we solve it? Well, we say well, just leave things alone, free things up, and then through this magical process, a solution will emerge versus Magneto or your presidential candidate coming along and saying, no, I'm gonna do this right now. I'm gonna use power to do this right now. And that is an understandably much more appealing, like you want that to be true if you're the person who's hurting right now.
One of the things with Magneto, I mean, I guess, and I said I wouldn't dip into the comic books, but I will. And so he, in that format, he also creates like a mutant separatist island at one point in his long career. So the effort to sort of resolve things in the United States falls apart, and he founds this mutant civilization called Genosha. I mean, Magneto is a separatist in many cases. There's different iterations of him. There's one that's supremacist. There's one that's sort of just we cannot possibly share space because the other side, human beings, Homo sapien, will always view us as a threat and do what naturally happens in this life. When people are afraid, they turn to hatred and then eventually violence. And Genosha doesn't work out either. The humans do eventually cause the destruction of that as well. And he's just constantly vindicated. If you have followed the comics at all, at this point, Magneto has kind of been given sort of the mantle of being right, which I think is like a sign of the times, possibly, and where our politics, and particularly race relations, has gone in the United States. But no, I take your point, though, on the first X-Men movie with making everybody the same. Why not just do that?
It's not quite genocide, but it's not exactly coexisting either. And I think there's an important lesson in this for libertarians if we want to bring more people to our side and our way of seeing the world. As Aaron made this point in one of the plenary sessions, that we really need to understand other people's ideologies, the ideologies they adopt to justify that spring from the passions that they feel, that justify the steps that they want government to use coercion to achieve. And generally, I think that the way people develop their ideologies is largely based on whose suffering they see. It doesn't, again, spring from a place of, or not originally from a place of hatred. It's because they have connections. They have connections to, if you grow up gay in a very repressive society, or you have a very dear friend who went through that, you are not going to gravitate toward the Republican Party. This is the party of repression in your eyes. You're going to gravitate to the Democratic Party because these are good people, because they see the value in people like me, or the value in people like my friend. And because these are good people, then they will go ahead and adopt, they'll tend to look kindly on the other parts of the Democratic platform that they maybe don't think very much about, because they haven't seen the sort of suffering that causes. Whereas, if you grow up instead the child of an entrepreneur who complains so much about how hard it is just to put food on the table because of all of these regulations and the way that their larger competitors use government to block them from competing, then you're going to gravitate toward the Republican Party. I mean, at least they talk about deregulation and that sort of thing. And their agenda, you're going to gravitate toward them because you've seen the sort of suffering that that government regulation can put in place. They hurt people like my mother or my father, and then you're going to look kindly on the rest of that agenda that the Republican Party puts into their platform, because at least these are good people. They see the suffering of people like me.
Another person who wanted to stop suffering, if I could move us to Darth Vader, actually, so that we fit in our favorite.
and in each case, I think the key is to find out what it is that brought that person to the point where they've adopted this ideology, and all you need to do is validate whatever it was that suffering was that they experienced, that they saw. And when they see that you, a libertarian or that kind of a caring person, then all of a sudden that's what they needed to know if you were a good person and whether your ideology is worth anything. I think that's how we open minds to our perspective.
And you mentioned the pipeline to hatred. It's been kind of brought up a couple times, and Star Wars is one of these IPs that have given us like an actual memorable line about how you get there. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. And so Darth Vader, I think all of our mutual favorite here in these three. Middle of the road on justification. I think he is the second most justified, with Thanos being the least. He was born into slavery as Anakin Skywalker, made into a Jedi Knight, plagued by dreams of his mother dying, and then eventually his mother was kidnapped and murdered and died in his arms. He then deals with visions of his wife dying prematurely. She also dies. He brings about that death tragically in a sort of Greek tragedy sense, but like Anakin is like this character who never had choices in his life. He never had autonomy and freedom, either as a slave or as a Jedi, because they have to abstain from all sorts of things. And he was attracted to the dark side, I think, because the dark side was this ideology that said you can achieve freedom through power and through the things that you want. If I could geek out on the Sith code real quick. The Sith code. Through strength, I gain power. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. The Force shall set me free. The Sith and the Jedi are different in that they have different visions of what freedom is.
They sound like national conservatives.
Yeah. Well, the national conservatives would argue that they believe in abstention and that we believe in, getting everything that we want that feels good, right? They think we're hedonists, and they think they're kind of more pure.
Yeah, I guess because you had asked us before this to think about ranking them, and yes, I put Vader 2. I think the issue with Vader as a sympathetic or justifiable villain is that his arc is just handled poorly, and so it's hard to, like, you can see the seeds of a much richer and more interesting justification and story of sympathy for him in there, but I think Lucas puts those seeds in, but I don't think he knows he's doing it, and I don't think he understands them once he's planted them. And so you talk about like the lack of control. There's also, he's reacting against the Jedi, and the Jedi are presented in the prequels as this kind of calcified, lost, meandering group, but that's not played up well, and the conflict between those two is not highlighted to the extent that it could be. His fall comes far too quickly. Like I think that Revenge of the
jarring,
Sith
yeah.
is not as bad as Attack of the Clones, but it is a terrible movie.
That's my
And-
second favorite Star Wars movie
Okay.
you're talking about.
and I think the reason is because I find like basically the whole arc through that movie to be totally unconvincing because
Yeah.
the character at the beginning doesn't earn becoming the character at the end, but you can see like in more capable hands how it could have gotten
It's
there.
not the character's fault. So I may be, yeah, it's all George Lucas's fault. I may be the only person here in this room who is old enough to have seen A New Hope in the theater. Now, I was only 5 years old, okay? But you can't imagine what a disappointment it was, the prequels were, to a kid who saw A New Hope in theater in 77 and then Empire in 81 and then Return of the Jedi in 83 and waited almost 20 years for this prequel arc of how that kid came to be Darth Vader, because Lucas even talked about how Darth Vader thought that he was doing good. And I'm just so excited to see what it is. It turns this guy who was a Jedi, wanted to do good, into this monster who, would kill younglings. And they just totally botched it. I mean, yes, he experienced trauma. Yes, he was a slave, but they almost made being a slave look cool. I mean, because it gave him like slave armor, like
That's a quote
Cibola,
right
you can't
there.
mess with me because you'll have to pay for me, like so I can mouth off to you. I mean, so there was definitely trauma there, but they didn't really, obviously, but they didn't really portray it. And then, yeah, he had to leave his mother, and then he missed her, and he's haunted by these dreams, and I'm sure that's very traumatic. And then his mother was kidnapped and raped, let's be honest, and killed by the Tusken Raiders. So he lost his mother, and that's incredibly traumatic. I just don't. Oh, and there was also tension between Obi-Wan and the Jedi. I'll get
Well,
to
let's
that in a
like
second.
dig in on that.
But
on
I
that
just
victim
that
thing,
just
though.
doesn't get you to killing younglings. I mean, that's just not that much trauma. There could have been that much trauma, and something that I was talking to some other nerds about this recently when it occurred to me that part of the failing was Obi-Wan's or Ewan McGregor's, because if you think about it, one of the things that could have justified Anakin snapping and just going to the dark side is if Obi-Wan had been more of a dick, had just beat him like a rented mule because he didn't want to look bad in front of Yoda. All the elements were there for him to do that, but Ewan McGregor played him so well. He was so like fatherly and loving
But what
toward
about the
Anakin.
Jedi Order?
that-
Because the Jedi Order's failure institutionally is one of those things that sort of makes him jaded. Like he's raised to believe that the Jedi are sort of the guardians of the galaxy, that they have virtues and sort of a moral high ground, but then they participate in all sorts of barbarity, war, deception, lying. I sort of think of like the ability to kill younglings as like his real belief that this institution is not fit to be part of the galaxy that he wants to see, that has seen 20 years of really awful, awful civil war that he's going to bring to an end with an empire. Like, no more democracy, no more choosing. We're going to do totalitarianism, and there will be peace.
And there's supposed to be that what Aaron mentioned, that not just calcification, but that the Jedi have themselves become evil. They just didn't sell that, I don't think. I mean, sure, they were blind. Sure, they were participating in a war that they probably should not have. But so evil that I have to exterminate them now, they just didn't sell that.
I mean, I do think the politics of the prequel are the most interesting parts of those movies, even if they're not highlighted in the way that they ought to have been. And there is an aspect to, so Anakin as the kind of petulant youth who then just gets mad about, like, if he hasn't earned his arc, he comes off as almost like your angry incel who then goes and shoots people up.
Yeah, Kylo Ren too.
And it mirrors a lot of the critiques you see from like the liberal right of the current like American decadence, right? Like the Jedi the Old Republic became this decadent society that had like lost its way and its ability to do anything and its ability to solve any problems. And what we need is someone to take charge. And I think that's where you get more of the interesting justification. I mean, that's where Palpatine's justification in a lot of this is in saying this government has failed to serve the needs of its people, and what we need is someone to come in, unite it, take authority, and institute a new regime. And Vader, Vader doesn't really seem to have much in the way of politics in that so
Yeah,
much.
you
Like
remember
he's
this
just
scene
kind
here?
of this. Yeah, he's kind of an idiot. Anakin is kind of an idiot.
But like we all have friends like that, right?
Yes.
Like you ask them like, how do you think the system should work? And they say exactly what he said
Right.
here. Well, people should get together and decide what's in the best interest of the people and then do it. And they're like, that's what we do. The problem is people don't agree. Well, then we'll make them. Make them agree.
One thing the prequels gave us is that meme. That meme is wonderful.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's perfect.
Well as the line, "This is how liberty dies," with thunderous applause.
Yeah. Oh, and in the newest Andor show, we've been gifted a new.
I have
really
not
amazing
seen
quote.
it yet,
No,
and
just a
so
quote. Just a quote.
I need to get over to the next session. It's about 4:25 right
Yeah.
now. So
do that. We'll finish up on Thanos here, Michael. Y'all, round of applause for Mr. Cannon. We could do Star Wars all day, but let's wrap up on Thanos here. So Thanos, destroyer of worlds. This guy is from the world of Titan. As best we know from his cinematic bio, his homeworld was facing overpopulation and the diminishment of resources, which sounds like a mismanagement problem. And basically, their world does face catastrophe. He loses a lot of people. And he travels the galaxy conquering worlds, wiping out 50% of populations that he faces. And he does so by war and conquest. What we see in the Avengers movies is that he wants, the Infinity Stones and the Gauntlet so that he can do it easily and not have to, wage wars. He can just snap his finger and eliminate 50% of what he views as sort of a parasitic, natural life problem, that the world or the galaxy will never be balanced as long as there's this many people. Malthusian much?
Yeah, this is another one where I think the tension between the villain and what the writers believe comes to the fore a bit, because obviously I don't think the writers of the Avengers movies are in favor of killing half the population, and his hatred of life they're not into. But I think they do think that, like, the Malthusian arguments and the resource depletion arguments, you get the sense they probably think that's right.
Agree, yeah.
And so this is why I think Thanos he's not sympathetic. And part of the reason he's not sympathetic and why I think he's just like a really boring villain is that you can see Magneto has a motivation we can understand, right? Like reacting against the Nazis and then everything that flows from that. Vader has traumas that he's responding to. Thanos just like gets it wrong, right? Like his fundamental thing that kicks him off is just wrong. So it'd be like if someone who was like, I want to save the world, and my biggest concern is microchips in vaccines, and so I'm going to kill everyone who's producing vaccines. We wouldn't be like, well, he's got to, it's just like, no, he's just like, he's an idiot. Like this is obviously not true. And then everything that flows from it is just from this fundamental mistake. But I don't know that fundamental mistake the writers of the movies are aware is a mistake.
Yeah, and I put this up here just because Politico really like self-owned themselves this week by not ironically like giving Vladimir Putin recognition as an environmental hero for waging war on Ukraine. It's very just a bizarre thing, but like you sort of see this come out in a lot of ugly ways, I think, with our elites and particularly those of the progressive left. Like they sort of really, really view climate change and overpopulation as an ends justify the means sort of situation. And you get Thanos. So you're like, I assume most Hollywood people think of Malthus as being correct. But then they make Thanos and they sort of self-own themselves again, like making the bad guy. I just want to ask you, because you study this stuff a lot and Cato writes a lot about this, can we have a more like robust biodiversity and a great merger of species and environment and prosperity, while also still growing our population constantly? We are a species in constant growth. How do we sort of make the argument to people that you can have both?
I mean, I'm not an expert in environmental issues, but one of the ways that growth happens, the way that we become richer, is first by figuring out how to do things that we couldn't do before. But another way is how to do things with less stuff, more outputs with fewer inputs. And so a lot of economic growth is figuring out how to be more efficient in the use of our resources. And one of the things that wealth does is enables us to care more about the environment, then if we're dirt poor subsistence, like we will clear cut those forests, burn all those trees, because otherwise we're not going to survive. But if we're fabulously wealthy, then suddenly we can start caring about having parks and reforestation and saving the whales and so on. Like that's a luxury that it takes wealth to provide. And so is there an upper bound? I don't know, but it doesn't, every time there's been a prediction of like we've hit it and now like resource deplete, like we haven't gotten there and we figured out the next thing that's going to enable us to use the resources more efficiently. So I don't want to say like the answer to your question is absolutely population can grow in infinity and we can keep using this stuff, but I haven't seen the evidence that we're there yet. And it certainly does not seem like, I mean, the other dumb thing about Thanos is he is worried about resource depletion in the universe, which is an awfully big place. And my sense is like, so even if you use up one of your planets, just like, they all have spaceships, go to the next one. It just...
Very strange, very strange. We could riff on this a long time. We are up against time, so I'll be in the continuing conversations room if you want to keep geeking out about some of this stuff. I've got 4 copies of my book left if you want to pick one up as well, so I'll be there signing those and giving those out. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.